Hello and welcome to the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center's Teachers Workshop Series on Genocide. This is session 6, the Armenian Genocide. Inside the folder where you found this video link, you also find the PowerPoint that I'm going to be showing. Please note that it's obvious that this is graphic in nature, so you'll want to preview this if or before you use with students. Speaking of students, while this presentation will be more brief than the previous two, which were on Yugoslavia during the Holocaust and World War II, and then in the 90s and 2000s, this is going to be more brief than that. But this subject, for whatever reason, was able to generate more activities. So in that same folder, you should find 6 different activities that you can use with students. You'll want to make sure that you adjust them as necessary to make sure that they are grade/age appropriate. As I always do, as I have for the first 5 sessions, I would like to thank the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education for their ongoing support, along with the Merrill Color Educator Series. Both of these institutions have been of great assistance for our educational endeavors. They are both supportive of us helping teach teachers how to teach these difficult subjects. All right, so to begin, I would like to kind of set the tone with 2 different quotes, show a couple of images that are representative of the Armenian Genocide, in my opinion, and then briefly discuss that this is still considered controversial, that there's scholarship that kind of takes both sides of the story, and so we'll examine that a little bit. But first, a quote, and this is allegedly from a telegram from the Minister of the Interior, Talat. Now, if you're not familiar with Talat, I will be covering him as we go, of course, but if you want more on him, an interesting story on how he and his assassination that takes place later on in Germany actually influences Raphael Lemkin and his creation of the term genocide. So that's an interesting story, kind of a side story, and that is in session 1's folder, the video there. But this is allegedly, I say, from Talat. It has been previously communicated that the government, by the order of the Assembly, has decided to exterminate entirely all the Armenians living in Turkey. Those who oppose this order can no longer function as part of the government. Without regard to women, children, and invalids, however tragic may be the means of transportation, an end must be put to their existence. So that is from a government official, allegedly, and they're kind of a cold, calculating look at how to deal with the Armenian question. Here's another quote, and this quote is from a soldier named Shalm Bey. And this is a person who earlier on in his life had participated in at least a massacre. This is what he said. I saw an Armenian girl whom I knew and who was very beautiful. I called her by name and said, "Come, I will save you and you shall marry a young man of your country, a Turk or a Kurd." She refused and said, "If you wish to do me a kindness, I will ask one thing which you may do for me." I told her I would do whatever she wished, and she said, "I have a brother, younger than myself, here amongst these people. I pray you kill him before you kill me, so that in dying I may not be anxious in mind about him." She pointed him out, and I called him. When he came, she said to him, "My brother, farewell. I kiss you for the last time, but we shall meet, if it be God's will, in the next world, and he will soon avenge us for what we have suffered." They kissed each other, and the boy delivered himself to me, the soldier. I must needs obey my orders, so I struck him one blow with an axe, split his skull, and he fell dead. Then she said, "I thank you with all my heart, and shall ask you one more favor." She put her hands over her eyes and said, "Strike as you have struck my brother, one blow, and do not torture me." So I struck one blow and killed her. and to this day I grieve over her beauty and youth and her wonderful courage. Women and children tend to be the victims of what we addressed in session 1: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. And here we see two images that maybe, along with that quote, kind of capture that sense. Earlier, I said that this was controversial. There are writings, there's scholarship going back as far as right after World War I and a few years after the Armenian Genocide. One book was written in 1937, and it suggests that the Talat telegrams are authentic. However, there was a work in 1983, the authors Orel and Yucca, and they did a work, it was called Talat Pasha Telegrams, Historical Fact or Armenian Fiction. And it, not surprisingly, based on the name, it claims that the telegrams were forged and that that using the term genocide or massacre is a misapplication of those terms. You can tell that the bias is coming from the Turkish side in that case. An author named Dadrian took up the cause in 1986, so a few years later, and did a work on the documents that led to the destruction of the Ottoman Armenians. And the crux of his work was that he said that the work done by Orel and Yucca was loaded with misleading information. So he's coming from the other side of things. So he's bringing his bias as well. There's been further denial and claims up to this day. And we'll see that at the end, that much of what we'll see that's taking place back here is repeating itself now. I mean, contemporarily, it is November 19th, 2020, and there are still issues that are taking place, and there is still denial, in fact, official denial from the Turkish government. So that brings up our first activity, an activity alert, if you will. One is to have students create an exhaustive bibliography on the subject. They will find a noticeable compare and contrast. And so they could actually set up a compare and contrast column, one that says, you know, this is historical fact, it took place, and one that says it's an exaggeration or never took place, or you could call it a denial column, and do a comparison and compare and contrast of the information that's offered and weigh the evidence from various sources. And if at the end of that, they can kind of come to their own conclusion based on the evidence by doing a survey of maybe 5 from each of the columns. Or they could take the other side of it and look at the denial side, and they could do an analysis of the documentation that's provided. All right, so to begin now with the historical side, the timeline side of it. When did the Armenian Genocide take place? Well, under cover of World War I. So between 1915 and 1916, fierce fighting going on, World War I, and it provided the perfect cover. Of course, we see that again, many instances, the Holocaust being prominent among that. Couched within World War II was the Holocaust. Again, war providing cover for up to genocide, but also any of the other 3 mass human rights violations: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. Different sources suggest different numbers of people who were killed, of Armenians who were murdered. The Jewish Virtual Library, an excellent resource, claims or suggests 1.5 million people, which that seems to be the kind of the number that's mostly accepted. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, or USHMM, gives a pretty broad range between 664,000 and 1.2 million of the 1.5 million who were living there. So slightly different from the Jewish Virtual Library, which suggested 1.5 million. Now, another author named Rummel suggests a higher number of 1.8 million of 2 million people living there. So that shows that we don't have a really good census for how many people were living there. We've got numbers between 1.5 and 2. We've got a range now of people, of Armenians murdered, of 664,000 up to 1.8 million people. Now, Rummel most likely is including Armenians who were not just killed during the 1915 to 16 timeframe, and who were not just killed within Armenia, as there were more killings, as we'll see a little bit of, that took place outside of Turkey after World War I. The last source, another excellent source, Genocide Watch, also concludes at 1.5 million. Now, this event, the Armenian Genocide, is not the first instance of, in this case, Turks killing Armenians. The first time actually goes back to the 1894 to 1896. There was a sultan named Sultan Abdul Hamid. And during his reign, the Turks killed something between 100,000 and 300,000. Various sources claim different numbers, so it gives us a big, broad range. The killing was actually intervened by the British government, who ordered equality between the Armenians and the Muslim majority. It was interpreted that the Muslims being ordered to stop the massacre of Christians by a then Christian nation was actually anti-Turk or anti-Muslim. You know, this is interesting. This is similar to Yugoslavia, whether during World War II or more contemporarily in the 90s and 2000. Turkey was also multiracial. It was also multicultural. There were, aside from Turks and Armenians, there were Greeks, there were Bulgarians, there were Syrians, there were Jews, and others. But just like Yugoslavia, special cultural, historical, absolutely religious, and linguistic differences were there, making conflict possibly more inevitable. The second time that we have examples of the Turks murdering the Armenians or killing the Armenians was again under Hamid, and this was in 1908. Now, there was a government overthrow at that time by a group who appeared to be liberal and reform-minded. They were known as the Committee for Union and Progress. People know them as the Young Turks. They instituted changes universally, and that included a representative parliament, full religious and civil liberties, and a liberal democracy, a constitutional democracy. So the overthrow of Hamid looks like it could be the rebirth of a Turkey that demonstrated constitutional democracy and promoted equality. However, there was a counter coup about a year later by supporters of the Sultan. They went, of course, versus the Young Turks. That ended up backfiring, and it actually ended up in the result was that Hamid was deposed and then exiled. Shortly following that, a large-scale Armenian massacre took place in a region where mobs of citizens and Turkish soldiers killed possibly as many as 30,000 Armenians. So a good question to ask is, what explains the switch that we'll see of the Young Turks from being liberal, reform, constitutional, parliamentary, democratically run government to what we'll see that comes out of there, which is an ethnic nationalism based on ethnicity, based on race, based on religion. So a good question. I mean, was it planned, or was it a natural evolution? Well, they ended up becoming despots. They declared a state of siege and actually suspended constitutional rights. It ended up centralizing power and, of course, suppressed minorities, and the minorities were those groups I just mentioned, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, the Jews, the Syrians, and especially the Armenians. So now we have to ask, are these killings that we've seen and are going to see, are they random? Are they government sponsored? Well, it looks as though the Young Turks' highest councils were involved in a decided move to exterminate the Armenians, all of them, as we saw in that quote by Talat. So what were they looking for? If they came in liberally minded, quickly switched to an ethnic nationalism, wanting to purge minorities, what were they looking for? And it's a return to the golden age when the Turks and what is called Turkism was lauded. And this is reminiscent of what we saw in session 2, if you attended session 2, on Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge were looking back on the ancient days of the Khmer Empire and the Khmer Kingdom and revering the good old days. Certainly we see it with the Holocaust with Teutonic Germany looking back. Well, the Young Turks wanted to unite all ethnic Turks. So they're looking for purity of blood, not unlike Hitler, who wanted to unite Austrians, who were essentially Germanic in his mind, and the Germanic peoples of Western Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. So parallels again with different examples of genocides. Well, the Young Turks got involved in the Italo-Turkish War, and that just added to the population's discontent with the Young Turks, actually. And so that discontent led to chaos. And so the government, in order to retain control, had to become more and more centralized, more and more repressive, and they did so through a campaign of terror. So for example, by July 11th of 1911, the Young Turk government had assassinated 3 opposition writers, including one in the open street. Now that is reminiscent of session 3, where we talked about Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, where the powers that be, Diaz, had people, the press, people who wrote oppositionally to him, had them assassinated. So this idea of open assassination was utilized. In June of 1912, military officers revolted, and they actually forced the Young Turks out. So short-lived for the Young Turks, but of course, the fact that we know that term, that name so well, tells us that we'll see them again. So the Young Turks were ushered out, and this new idea, this new concept called the Great Cabinet was formed, and this was a government made up of the old dignitaries. So this was now an ebb and flow, going from the idea of the Sultan, and now we've got these other old dignitaries, and then an interlude of these Young Turks. And this Great Cabinet idea would last until the First Balkan War in October of 1912. So again, they're also very short-lived. Between the First Balkan War and January of 1913, chaos and a sense of wanting to adopt a settlement by European powers exploded into a revolution. And this is where we see Colonel Enver Pasha Bey emerge. He was a hero during the 1909 Young Turk Revolution. We see Talat Pasha Bey and 200 supporters who seized a port, killed the liberal war minister, and essentially wrenched control. This now makes Enver Pasha the war minister, Talat, the minister of interior, and a close ally, Jamal Pasha, the minister of the navy. That created a very strong governing triumvirate. Again, they were in pursuit of a pure Turkey. So now we've gone from the Sultan to the Young Turks to the Great Cabinet to the Young Turks. Now we've got this strong triumvirate, and they wanted purity. Again, that idea of a purity of blood, Turkish blood. And to support that, during that during that first Balkan War, the loss of 750,000 Bulgarians actually was for the Young Turks an unexpected benefit. Now, with the Young Turks reemerging as being in charge of the government, they denounced that armistice that we mentioned and renewed their war with Bulgaria. It was disastrous. They lost numerous battles and ended up actually ceding territory. Any of the territory that they had that was in Europe, considered Europe, they actually ended up ceding that. So that was a disastrous move. So Turkey needed to reset themselves, right? They called for national unity. They wanted to modernize, in that they considered multicultural traditions as handicaps. This again is reminiscent of Mexico and the Mexican Revolution in Session 3. They wanted national unity. They wanted to modernize the country, and they saw standing in the way was this idea of multicultural and traditional peoples. In a sense, losing that European territory meant that Turkey could really become a homeland exclusively for Turks. In other words, they could isolate themselves and create ethnic purity. The Young Turks were the term I've seen used, super nationalists and racial purists. And they wanted to make Turkey glorious like in the Golden Age. So we've gone ebb and flow. We're back to that concept again of making Turkey reminiscent of their Golden Age, with heroic warriors, that kind of concept. And that again sounds like the Cambodian session 2, where the Khmer Rouge were looking back at their warlike people, the Khmer, during the Khmer Empire, and they wanted to revive that concept. And that actually prompts a second activity idea. Again, this is in the folder, and there'll be 6 different write-ups to kind of delineate the activities, but just so we talk about it briefly. An activity idea is to look for instances of changes in leadership in history in this idea of hearkening back to the greater days, the good old days. Conversely, you could do the activity of looking for examples of moving forward. Examples, of course, the glory of Rome, the ancient glory of Rome, the contemporary idea of making America great again. The idea of Cambodia, looking back on the Khmer people, the Khmer Empire. Moving forward, the idea of hope and change. The idea in Nazi Germany of glorifying their past, their Teutonic past, and also kind of melding in other ideas like the ancient glory of Rome as well. Of course, that's one of those. This is an activity that you'd want to be careful of in terms of politics, contemporary politics. So you could do it up until, pick a time frame that's up to 1900 or up to 1950, and that way you'd be able to still have a lot of examples where you could find this idea of hearkening back to glory and to reviving that glory, or eschewing that concept and moving forward to a new time. All right, so now we revisit the Young Turks, who are now led by Talat Pasha. Talat, he was the Minister of the Interior. He is now leading the Young Turks. They saw World War I as an opportunity to gain territory. They wanted to gain territory in North Africa and even in parts of Russia. So Turkey ended up signing a defensive alliance with the Germans, having noticed that the Germans were successful early on, probably kind of tipped their hand to go that direction. Germany was pressuring Turkey to enter the war, to officially enter the war. In fact, the German commander-in-chief of the Turkish Navy deployed the Turkish Navy to bombard Russian Black Sea harbors and ships. Now, the Russians ended up declaring war on the Turks in 1914, followed by the Brits and the French. This was all kind of prompted by the German commander of the Turkish Navy. World War I saw continued losses, and this is my term, may or may not be fair, but military ineptitude for the Turks. Embedded within battles, we see an example of what I'm talking about, of military ineptitude. Enver Pasha's brother-in-law launched an unsuccessful attack. The loss became obvious, and as it did, his brother-in-law, who was named Cevdet Bey, quote, ordered the cold-blooded killing of about 800 people, mostly men, women, and children, in the Salmas district. So now for this next section, I would like to kind of focus on intent and then see if we can provide some proof that this did in fact take place. In session 1, we talked again about the definitions here from the United Nations page, un.org, and then there's the definitions: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. We discussed these in some depth, and one of the things that we looked at was not just the physical element of the crime, but the mental element or the intent. In this case here, they're describing the mental element as the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Then it goes on into the physical elements. As stated here, the intent is the most difficult element to determine, and that makes sense because we're interpreting words, we're interpreting actions, and then we're trying to read into the minds of people what was the motivation. So the intent is the most difficult element to determine. In this case, for it to constitute genocide, there had to be proven intent on the perpetrators to lead to this physical destruction of the national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. We see intent play a role in the definition of war crimes as well. War crimes, which we did go over, includes a long laundry list of acts. These are the physical acts that constitute war crimes. When we get to the elements, this is where we see again that idea of war crime being two elements: the contextual side, in other words, the physical side embedded within, in this case for war crimes, obviously had to be a war. War crimes contains two elements, the second of which is the mental element or intent. This means the intent and knowledge, both with regards to the individual act and the contextual element. Well, with the Young Turks had to, in pursuit of their goal of reviving that golden age of Turkey and Turkism, and creating an ethnically or racially purified country, they had to deal with that number, that 1.5 to 2 million Armenians and as many as 1.7 million Greeks. For the Greeks, which we won't go into, we may touch on a little bit, but for the most part, we won't touch on. So that could be a whole separate area of study if someone is interested in finding the plight of the Greeks from, say, 1915 up to 1923, with their connection to the Young Turks and Turkey/Ottoman Empire. Anyway, for the Greeks, the Young Turks decided that deportation would be the best tactic. So deport them from nearby the Ottoman Empire's Turkish border, and from the coast as well, and to drive them into the interior. The Armenians, however, were to be handled differently. Now, in part because countries that would have allied themselves with the Armenians would have included certainly Britain and Russia, for example. And Britain and Russia were at that time enemies of the Ottoman Empire / the Turks. And because Britain and Russia were already embroiled in World War I, their attention was not on the Armenians. In addition, the Germans did not express outright reservations for the massacres that were taking place. In other words, they kind of allowed it. It was tacit approval by the Germans. And that's how the Young Turks took it. Now, the final decision, like in the Holocaust, the Wannsee Conference, that decision to finally say, we're going to eliminate all of Europe's 9 million Jews. Well, it's the same concept here. The decision to eliminate all the Armenians within the borders of Turkey may have included a secret organization that was run by high government officials, but it was definitely supervised by young Turk committee members, so supporters of. It was also manned by, and in many cases perpetrated by, convicts. So that brings up our third activity idea, which is to look into instances where a government utilizes convicts based on their propensities, their talent, to take action for the government. So the most obvious example is the Einsatzgruppen from during the Holocaust, who were the Einsatzgruppen police units and auxiliary units and volunteers, lots of volunteers who stepped up. It also included convicts, ex-convicts, criminals, people who had been released specifically for that role, which was, in the case of the Einsatzgruppen, was to round up, to terrorize, to humiliate, and then ultimately to murder Jews. Finding some other examples of where governments employ criminals to do the dirty work might be an interesting activity to do. So now what we'll do is look at evidence, proof. An example. In this case, the Muslims killed 60,000 people at a town called Maush, M-O-U-S-H. That included the surrounding area as well, not just the town, but the town and the outskirts of the town. They also are alleged to have killed 55,000 in the Van province. That's already over 100,000, 110,000, 115,000 people, Armenians killed. There were some barely known heroes who, in terms of the Holocaust, we refer to as rescuers and resistors. For example, in Constantinople and some other major cities, foreign consuls or ambassadors refused to deport Armenians. They refused the deportation of Armenians from those cities into the hands of the Young Turks and their armies and their convicts. That's reckoned to have saved approximately 200,000 people's lives. So that's heroic. It was resistance. Also, just like during the Holocaust, not all the locals helped. Many did not help. Many actually refused orders. Even government officials didn't help. The latter would be deposed for refusing orders. Now, some Muslims disapproved of these mass killings too. It's not surprising, and that's according to testimony from a German doctor named Johann Lepsius. He was a German Red Cross official, and sometimes Muslims who wanted to refuse were forced to participate. The Third Army commander, for example, ordered soldiers to execute any Turk who aided an Armenian, and to do so in front of that person's house, the Turk's house. Then the house was subsequently burned down. Any official who helped was court-martialed. All right, so we've touched on the fact that the government was involved. Maybe it was a secret cabal within the government. Maybe it was out in the open. Well, in support of that, I have a quote, and this is by a doctor, Dr. Nazim, who was the Minister of Education. He states, Dr. Nazim states, let us think well. Why did we bring about this revolution? What was our aim? Was it to dethrone Sultan Hamid and his men and take their places? I don't think it was for this. It was to revive Turkism that I became your comrade, brother, and fellow traveler. I only want that the Turk shall live, and I want him to live only on these lands and be independent. With the exception of the Turks, let all the other elements be exterminated. no matter to what religion or faith they belong. This country must be purged of alien elements. The Turks must do the purging. That is a quote from the Minister of Education, which is frightening. From that same meeting, a different person, the Javid, Minister of Finance, noted, at the order of Talat, the votes are collected and counted. The result was that the resolution to exterminate the Armenians, provided not a single should be left alive, was passed unanimously. So those are internal. We have Talat's quote, we have Dr. Nazim's quote, we have Javid's quote, but we also have a quote from Henry Morgenthau, American ambassador Henry Morgenthau. And he's writing about a meeting that he had in person with Talat. According to Morgenthau, Talat told me, this is Morgenthau, Talat told me that the Union and Progress Committee, which we call the Young Turks, had carefully considered the matter in all its details, and that the policy which was being pursued was that which they had officially adopted. The deportations, the primary mechanism of extermination, were the result of prolonged and careful deliberation. So now we have evidence not from an American ambassador as well. At a point, Morgenthau then contradicted himself and said that the government was not to blame. So the response from the Turkish government was, you are greatly mistaken. We have this country absolutely under our control. I have no desire to shift the blame onto our underlings, and I am entirely willing to accept the responsibility myself for everything that has taken place. The cabinet itself has ordered the deportations. These are the Young Turks defending proof that the genocide was prescribed by the government and in fact did take place. So more proof. Orders sent by Talat via telegram, we talked about one already, went out to governors and other officials, and that ended, some of those telegrams ended up in the hands of allies during World War I. One of those orders signed off by Talat, Minister of Interior, is dated May 15th, 1915, and it reads, it has been previously communicated that the government, by the order of the Assembly, has decided to exterminate entirely all the Armenians living in Turkey. Those who oppose this order can no longer function as part of the government. Without regard to women, children, and invalids, however tragic may be the means of transportation, an end must be put to their existence. That's the quote we first started with. We have evidence now in their words, their vigorous defense of their actions. In other words, they were proud of what they were doing. They were proud of their plans. They obviously thought their plans were legitimized. Another telegram that was sent out was kind of cryptic in a way, and it almost looks like a secret message. It simply said, quote, take care of the Armenians. That was sent to numerous government officials and well-placed police chiefs around the country at a specific given time and date. Seems like a code word to initiate something, right? And I assume that taking care of the Armenians was probably not to actually provide care for them, but to handle the situation. In other words, to start resolving the Armenian question. What we'll look at next is that this genocide was planned because we see it in stages that follow a pattern. All right, so here we see Henry Morgenthau on the left and one of the telegrams from Talat on the right. That will launch us into this process that was used, the 6-step process that was used for how the intent was realized, the intent of the Turkish government to massacre and exterminate every Armenian within Turkey. All right, so firstly, there were 200 to 250 Armenians who were drafted into the military. And they were seen as fodder. Through military orders, they could be forced to go on more dangerous missions. They could be used in labor battalions where they would be, not unlike forced labor during the Holocaust, they would be worked to death, where they would be starved, where they would be exposed to the elements, whether it was intense heat or intense cold, disease as well. So they were drafted in the military, pushing 250,000, and then they were used as fodder. Of those drafted, approximately 200,000 died. In February of 1915, all Army commanders received a telegram. That telegram was signed by Enver Pasha as Deputy Commander General and Minister of War, and read, "In view of the present situation, the total extermination of the Armenian race has been decided by an imperial order. The following operations are to be performed to that effect. 1. All Ottoman subjects over the age of 5 years bearing the name Armenian and residing in the country should be taken out of the city and killed. 2. All Armenians serving in the imperial armies should be separated from their divisions without creating incidents, then taken into solitary places away from the public eyes and shot. 3. All Armenian officers in the army should be imprisoned in their respective military camps until further notice." 48 hours later, specific orders were issued for their execution. So the role of the military stands out. All right. Secondly, the second tactic or approach, as a ploy directed against the Armenians, all Armenians in all villages and towns had to turn in their guns or face severe penalties. Then the Turkish soldiers came along with the police and ransacked homes where gun ownership was suspected. Many Armenians were shot, many were tortured and or killed, and guns were confiscated. So that brings up now a fourth activity idea. Again, this is one you'd want to consider political implications depending on the school and principal and the like. But to set up a compare and contrast of Kristallnacht, where guns were also confiscated from Jews right before the action was taken against the Jews on Kristallnacht, and compare that to this kind of gun confiscation scheme. That opens up the idea of looking into other instances where gun ownership was eliminated or guns were confiscated and a genocide or any of the mass human rights violations followed. The third part of the approach was for the arrest of top leaders and intellectuals, politicians, doctors, lawyers, teachers, the clergy, writers, and so forth. And then they were transferred into the interior, which is reminiscent of the idea of the Holocaust about being transported east. This into the interior had the same kind of ending. It was a euphemism to their death. The targeting of leaders, of intellectual leaders, once again goes back to the Cambodian genocide, where it is most stereotypically thought of as people with glasses who were therefore most likely to be readers were to be targeted. And that's a real generality. But the idea that intellectuals and teachers and lawyers and engineers and so forth, people who went to school people who went to college, people who could read, people who maybe had a Western orientation were targeted. And we see that here in this kind of this third step. One, you massacre the people who've been drafted into the military. Two, confiscate guns. Three, arrest leadership. Now who's left? Well, shopkeepers, laborers, doorkeepers and messengers of all sorts. So workers, kind of blue collar. They were the next people to be arrested. And the same idea was followed about them being deported into the interior. That brings to mind the pastor Martin Niemöller quote of, first they came for the communists, but I did not stand up because I was not a communist. Then they came for the Jews, but I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left for me. There's a million variations of it, but it's the same idea. First they came for the soldiers, then they came for the guns, then they came for leadership, then they came for the blue collar people. This is that same kind of idea taking place here with the Armenian Genocide. So I'll ask the question again. Now who's left? So the remaining people were to be targeted at this phase, at this fifth stage or phase, were the able-bodied. And it followed a very specific process. The town crier would call, or a bulletin would be posted for all Armenians who were 15 years or older to appear at a designated time in a designated location, like a town square, a government building, or so forth. All right, the idea of posting bulletins and having people report to a certain place is, Baba Yar comes to mind in the Holocaust. And the idea of Armenians of 15 years and older, that's reminiscent of Kristallnacht, where Jewish males aged 16 and over were arrested because of the ability or the more of a likelihood that they might fight back. So that was the phase. Essentially rounding up Armenians of age 15 and older. Once they were gathered, then they were in prison where they languished for days. Then the soldiers and the police would actually rope them together and march them to some secluded spot and execute them. Sometimes there are stories that the local police targeted Armenians in the street, so random targeting. But generally speaking, this followed that pattern. And again, reminiscent of Baba Yar, the Einsatzgruppen, for comparisons. And a sixth phase. So there might have been a slight delay after that fifth stage there, up to maybe a week or so, where the goal would have been ransacking, pillaging, stealing, robbing homes. And what they did was, while those able-bodied 15 and older people were arrested, and before they'd been taken for execution, their homes were given to Muslim refugees. Now, at this stage, right, most of the men were gone. So now that leaves women, children, and the elderly. And of course, that's the group that was less likely to resist. And so that was a very systematic approach to getting rid of the soldiers first, and then the young boys who might fight. And now we have women, children, and old people left. Now the town crier would come back and would state that all Armenians, meaning those who were remaining, women, children, and old timers, were to prepare for deportation to a location which was to be determined. Now, women had an option. Women could choose to convert on the spot to Islam, and that would allow them to stay. Those who could prove that they'd already married a Turk could also stay. And that kind of mixed marriage idea, and the fact that carried some positive weight for the woman, is reminiscent of the idea from the Holocaust again of the Michelin. So Michelin marriage was between a Jew and a non-Jew. And there's a parallel there. The Michelins, as long as they kept very quiet and kept out of view, they were able to survive even within Germany. So women had an option. They could convert. They could prove that they were already married to a Turk. And then lastly were the children. And the children had to be turned over to Muslim orphanages, where they would be brought up in the new customs and faith of Islam. That is reminiscent from the Holocaust of an idea called Lebensborn. Those were children who were either kidnapped, as long as they had the external Aryan look, they could be kidnapped and taken back to Germany to be raised as new Germans and to forget maybe their Polish heritage, their Polish language and culture and so forth, but to be raised up and to adopt their new country. Not voluntary, of course. The other Lebensborn children were children of SS soldiers in different countries, Norway, for example, where they had an overnight relationship with a local woman who also had the features, the Aryan features, and then the child, when it was born, was taken from the mother. The SS soldier, probably unaware that a pregnancy even took place, and the child was then cared for in these different houses to be sent back to Germany to be raised as a proper German. So there's some more strange parallels between the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust. Well, that period of the up to a week or so allowed women to settle their affairs. Yet the Armenians couldn't sell their real estate, or if they owned animals, they couldn't sell their animals. Again, once they were gone, the property, the homes were gifted to Muslim immigrants. Those who were able to somehow sell their real estate, of course, practically got nothing for it because they were desperate. What remained, what few items remained, were then carried by the Armenians on their back or via an ox cart type of caravan. And strangely, some of the ox cart caravans were lent by the Turkish authorities, and I think it was maybe to expedite the killing. There were, of course, masochistic guards who refused the Armenians water on their trek through the desert into the interior. And at some stage, the cart drivers refused to go any further, as they were getting too far away from their homes and their water and supplies and so forth. So they actually forced the Armenians, these women, children, and old timers out. Now they had to, as vagabonds, had to march with their possessions in their hands or on their back over rough terrain in the blazing heat and often without access to water. So when they got to a well or a stream, those guards would sometimes forbid the Armenians from drinking any water. This is very similar, of course, to the death marches that we saw during the Holocaust and also in Cambodia during the Cambodian genocide. Just like the death marches in both places, stragglers were just executed alongside the road as they fell. People often died from thirst, from exposure, from hunger, and general neglect. In addition, similar to the death marches in both places, the Holocaust and in the Cambodian genocide, villages along the way were often pre-warned that the caravan was coming. So they would now come out and meet these pathetic Armenians who were dying of thirst, who were carrying what they could, and the villagers would then plunder the caravans. There was often chaotic sexual assaults, and of course, killing was allowed to take place. When those caravans continued on and passed through areas where there were Kurdish tribes, the same thing generally happened, except that often attractive women and children were taken away by the Kurds as sex slaves. And I mentioned previously about the use of convicts, and here's another place where we see that. Prisoners were actually brought in to then attack the convoys and to repeat the above: theft and sexual assault. But in some cases, even that wasn't fast enough. That wasn't efficient enough. For example, the Army's 86th Cavalry Brigade was used to attack convoys from one particular town, where they stripped the Armenians of their clothes and led them to a gorge that is so reminiscent of Babi Yar in Ukraine during the Holocaust. So they stripped them, they led them to a gorge. And you know, the question, why would they strip them? Well, I suppose to steal their clothing, but also to prevent people from running, because your natural instinct is to huddle, out of humility, to huddle. If you have a loved one, to huddle with them, and you're way less likely to run. And the other idea, of course, being to humiliate the people. And so that's what this cavalry brigade did to this particular group. We also saw the same kind of idea in Yugoslavia, where there was the idea of using ditches, so reminiscent of pushing people off into ditches and off of cliffs that people, there was the nickname ditch men. So we have these people by this 86th Cavalry Brigade, naked, led to a gorge. And here we have from an author named Mazian, from a work in 1990, a quote: "At this gorge, this particular gorge called the Kemak Gorge, some Armenians were bayoneted to death. Most, however, had their hands tied behind them and were thrown into a ravine where the Euphrates flows between two rock walls. This method of extermination was quick and expedient, as large numbers of people, 20,000 to 25,000, had to be eliminated. Roughly half of the Armenian population of that particular town were murdered at Kemak Gorge." Now, not all of the transportation was done by ox cart or on foot. They also used overcrowded cattle cars, the obvious connection to the Holocaust. If the train stopped, prisoners were forced to remain outside on the ground for days, sometimes even weeks, and of course were provided very little food or water. All right, so now we'll get into some details about the genocide itself. Most Armenians lived in the northeast part of the country. There were many; they were spread out throughout, but there were large portions in the northeast part of the country. Some were almost exclusive Armenian enclaves, so their leadership was Armenian. Their political party tended towards being Armenian. And in a way, it's similar to the plight of the Jews in the Holocaust, in that Armenians were familiar with their history of being the victims of massacres. So they lived in their enclaves. They were aware of their history. And so what was the genocide? This particular genocide, what did it look like? Well, we have the 60,000 who were killed at Maush, M-O-U-S-H, and surrounding area, and 55,000 or so in the Van province we talked about. Overall, it looks as though the young Turks may have deported, remember, on foot, cattle cart, ox cart, presumably other methods as well. In fact, by boat, we know is another. May have transported as many as 1.4 million Armenians. Of examples of 18,000 Armenians who were deported from a town, Malaysia, the number arriving at Aleppo, where there was a dispersal center, and we'll talk about concentration camps shortly, the number that arrived of that 18,000 was 150. Another example of 5,000 that were deported from Harput, 213 at the most survived. So whatever the number is that the total Armenian population, and whatever number we agree to as having been deported or transported, on average, it looks as though about 10% survived by arriving in their destination. That's according to the Deputy Director General of Settlement of Refugees. And he was informing his superior. So this isn't hearsay. This is a contemporary report, 10% according to him. Talat's number 57 telegram, done on January 10th, 1916, said, after investigation, it has been confirmed that 10% of the Armenian deportees have reached their place of exile. The rest have perished on the way by starvation and natural illness. You are informed that similar results will be accomplished by employing severe means against the survivors. And an American consul at the American Embassy suggested the number was about 15%. So 10 to 15% is a range based on two government officials of who survived the deportation, or what percentage survived the deportation. So a question is, what were these ultimate destinations? Well, this map is done by University of South Florida, USF, and it's very good. It really is. Lists the massacre sites, and the size of the red circle denotes the size of the massacre. So right off the bat, we can see that from Greece, Constantinople, you can see the direction, the directionals are there, the arrows, and you see that there were killings along the way, and killings that were more sizable. You can see that there were groups who were driven to the sea and then were taken away via ship, and there were some who were driven up into this area we called Armenia, that section called Armenia. Also down even into Lebanon and into the deserts. And you can see, we mentioned Van province, and there's that massacre right there. You also note the black dots. The sizable circles represent concentration camps. And then there were these smaller black dots represent the deportation checkpoints. And you can see the checkpoints all around these concentration camps. And you can see that the camps are located down in this section here in Syria. Well, the conditions in concentration camps were typically and expected, as you would expect, horrendous. When the camps became overfilled, prisoners were simply culled by killing them after they were moved from camp. So they did want to do the killing out of sight. The torture was this typical, is exactly what you would expect. It was devious and it was wicked. The Turks even pursued killing the Armenians, as well as other Christians, incidentally, outside of their territory. I mentioned 1915 to 1916 for the genocide, and then I noted that there were killings afterwards and outside of Turkey. So basically the killing lasted the duration of World War I, just like Hitler in World War II. So these Turks and other Christians outside of their territory amounted to about 200,000 people. And half of those died from a man-made famine, which brings up a fifth possibly interesting activity. And that's to research induced famine, government-induced famines. There was the induced famine in Syria and Lebanon by the Turks. We could compare that with the Holodomor in the Ukraine. If you dare, we could even look at the Irish potato famine. That would be one we would need to look at both sides, the biases of both sides. One side that says it was a natural disaster, one side that says it's possibly, some people have said the potato famine is actually a genocide perpetrated on the Irish people by the English people. That would be interesting to look into. That would be one that you would want to approach with caution, is the last part. But the idea of using induced famine, could be interesting. And when you look at this map and we think about, now this talks about the Armenian Genocide, and it puts it up to 1923. Again, for most people consider it 1915 to 1916, but the killings did go on, including outside of Turkey, especially in Greece, up to 1923. However, for our purposes, we're talking the genocide 1915 to 1916. Keep in mind that the Turks killed something like 300,000 to 1.4 million in a year, or in other words, 9% of their population. I have mentioned numerous times the parallels to the Holocaust, and there are more. For Turkey's economy, for their economic health, it was problematic that there was a minority, the Armenians, and they comprised so much of the middle class. They handled significant portions of the country's imports and exports, and domestic commerce as well. So this is like the Jews in Germany. The Jews in Germany, out of 60 or so million, represented less than 1%, somewhere between 550 and say 600,000, a tiny minority. Well, the Armenians were larger than that for sure, but they represented a large portion of well, we said import, export, and domestic commerce. As a minority, they represented a completely different religion and therefore had different cultural identities. Their religious and culture necessarily colored their approach to politics, and that colored view of politics differed from the majority, in this case, the Turks. Like we saw in Yugoslavia during World War II and the Holocaust. Also in the follow-up, when we looked at the 90s and 2000s, groups with such significant differences have two options: melt, a melting pot, or vie for either separation or one group controlling the other group. Now, in those instances, in those three instances, the Holocaust, Yugoslavia during World War II, and the 90s and 2000s, each time it resulted in mass human rights violations, genocides, and therefore groups trying to control one another. Another parallel with the Holocaust is monetary gain. The reason women weren't killed outright or right away was so the perpetrators could find their cash and their jewelry that they'd probably stashed or hidden somewhere. And it was similar, the deportations were similar as well, where women were encouraged to bring their valuables with them. Since they're being relocated, they wanted to make sure that they brought their valuables with them. And of course, just like during the Holocaust, those objects, those diamond rings, those gold necklaces, those treasured items were stolen. And a quote from a bishop: "I now asked the captain why he allowed these women and children to be deported to Aleppo, and he replied, 'If we had killed these women and children in the towns, we would not have known where their riches were, whether buried in the ground or otherwise hidden. That is why we allowed precious items, such as jewelry, to be taken. But after we had proceeded for about 4 hours, we came into a valley. With us were some 30 Turkish women who began to go through the clothing of the Armenian women and girls and took away the money and jewelry. It took them 4 days.'" So this is about theft. This is about theft of what to the owner were precious items that had monetary value, but were mementos, and just stolen outright because of their value, monetary value. Now it looks as though Talat and Henry Morgenthau had another conversation. And this comment, this quote, is extremely reminiscent of Kristallnacht. This is Talat. "I wish that you would get the American life insurance companies to send us a complete list of their Armenian policyholders. They are practically all dead now and have left no heirs to collect the money. It, of course, all escheats to the state. The government is the beneficiary now. Will you do so? Talat was asking outright for the insurance money for the people that they had murdered. And they knew that they didn't have any heirs because the heirs had presumably been murdered as well. A very bold and unapologetic way to handle that issue. Here we see the connection, the alliance, or evidence of the alliance of the Germans and the Turks. The killing did not stop with the end of World War I. Turkey was occupied by the French, by the Brits, and by the Greeks, and the latter especially, but all the above angered the populace. A man emerged because of this. Mustafa Kemal Pasha, also known as Kemal Ataturk or Ataturk. He ended up establishing a splinter rebel nationalist government while the sultans had come back and replaced the Turks, the young Turks. They fought, and the Sultan ended up signing a treaty in 1920, which is why we have that map that goes 1915 to 1923. Well, the Turks and the Armenians, of course, rekindled actions versus each other, for the most part being the... So the Turks rekindled their approach, their violent approach toward the Armenians. And within this context, we see that ingenious, creative, brutal cruelty that we've seen in various sessions before, that of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, in Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, preceding especially and during the Mexican Revolution, in Yugoslavia during the Holocaust, and again in the 90s and 2000s. The Ataturk killings within Turkey and outside of Turkey actually also had significant totals. Story for a different time. That leads us to our sixth and final activity idea. And it's the idea of making history relevant. Are there connections between the past and today? Well, the activity could be doing a simple internet search for Armenia-Azerbaijan war. Lasted about 6 weeks or so, at least temporarily. It concluded on November 15th. This is a rehashing of a brief war that took place between the Armenians and Azerbaijan at the conclusion of World War I. So I'll have a link or two for articles that discuss this. And then something else that's certainly optional, but like in the last activity, I like the idea of trying to bring music, and especially more contemporary music, into the activities for students especially. There is another link that I will include, and it takes you to a story about a band called System of a Down, SOAD. I would encourage you, if you're up to it, to listen to them first. They're very loud. This is not for the faint of heart, and the lyrics are also range from kind of brutal to bizarre. So you would want to look at that ahead of time. But this is something that students might be able to connect with. And especially because there are two songs that have just been released recently in direct connection to this war that I just mentioned, this Armenia-Azerbaijan war. We can see right here, one of the songs is called Genocidal Humanoids. And this is a quote from one of the band members. I had a lot of feelings of anger and powerlessness. And then I thought back to how my ancestors must have felt during the genocide. I sent a text to the other three guys, that would be the other three guys in the band, and said, irrespective of your feelings for each other and the past, we have to put everything aside and get in the studio and create a song for our people to bring attention to the situation and galvanize the forces of good worldwide. And so they did, and they put together two songs, that being Genocidal Humanoids and another being Protect the Land. I'll include the lyrics to both. So, are there connections between 1915 and today, over 100 years ago? Clearly there are, and there are connections to these gentlemen and their ancestors as well that they're referencing. Now the article is probably biased, as you would expect, but some good quotes for sure. Again, as you would expect from a rock band, they're political and they're unrestrained in what they say. So the lead singer is this man right here, Serj Tankian, and talking about the song Protect the Land, he said, the current corrupt regimes of Aliyev in Azerbaijan and Erdogan in Turkey now want to not only claim these two territories, including Armenia, as their own, but are committing genocidal acts with impunity on humanity and wildlife to achieve their mission. They are banking on the world being too distracted with COVID, elections, and civil unrest to call out their atrocities. So references to the past, references to what's going on now. Again, you would want to really take a look at this first and make sure it would be okay to touch on like Erdogan and Turkey, part of NATO. So you want to make sure that it would be an acceptable thing to look at based on your school. But kids might enjoy working with another rock band and lyrics and looking into that, to break down the lyrics and to look into those and to see if they reflect not only what just took place between September and November of 2020, but also what took place between 1915 and 1916 or 1915 and 1923. Your choice on that. And if the kids are really interested, they could choose one of these band members, and easy enough to get their names, and maybe do a real simple family tree and find out what their connections are to the Armenian Genocide. They would clearly say that this is not an alleged event, that this did happen for sure. According to Genocide Watch and Dr. Gregory Stanton, the creator of the 10 Stages of Genocide, Armenia, Turkey still denies that this took place, and therefore they are at stage 10, which is denial. Well, and despite their denial, we've seen a high level overview, and we've heard about numbers, and we've heard direct quotes from the players, and again, they certainly didn't seem to be at all ashamed of what they were doing. So what I've done for each of the sessions we've done before, you can see here, Cambodia, Mexico, Yugoslavia, what was once Yugoslavia again, and here, Turkey, the Armenian Genocide. Try to look at the players, the main government leaders, the Young Turks, to look at the genocide and then kind of give a name to the section that represented their time frame. So the Young Turks is one from 1909 to 1918 with a little interlude in there, a period of deposition from 1918 to 1920, and then rebellion, which we saw with Ataturk between 1919 and 1923. Each time we have tried to determine the type of governance that was utilized, because we've been wondering if one, in today's left-right paradigm, if one has more of a tendency to mass human rights violations and or to genocide. And we've seen a pretty far range of groups, and we've seen some interesting things: communist nationalism and fascist nationalism. Well, here, what we see is under the Young Turks, we see ethnic nationalism, strongly proud of their country, but to the exclusion of any others, including the Greeks, the Bulgarians, the Syrians, the Jews, and especially the Armenians. The Deposition Period was a monarchy, and it was essentially under a monarch. So it was one person rule. So it was like a despot. And then the rebellion with Ataturk, since Ataturk was one of the young Turks, not surprising that that ethnic nationalism or nationalism came up again. Another thing we looked at, something that we determined in session 1, is that despite looking at these left-right paradigm systems of governance, what seems to really be more of a player is this idea of totalitarianism without allowing for democracy, without allowing for free speech and free thought and so forth. And we've seen a lot of that. In fact, ultimately totalitarian, the majority of these are yes. And same thing here with the Young Turks. Other than that brief period when they were liberally minded and set up that parliament and the constitutional democracy, they were essentially totalitarian. In terms of numbers of human beings murdered, we have that number again that settles in about 1.5 million. It goes as high as 1.89 or so million, as low as 664,000. And most people go with that 1.5 or so. I have another source that said about 1.4. Not to be overlooked is under Ataturk. This is after the Armenian Genocide. 878,000 more people were killed. I put an asterisk because it does include Greeks, so it is not entirely Armenians, but this is a significant number of human beings murdered, in this case by Ataturk. Was genocide committed? In my opinion, yes, absolutely. It was by the Young Turks. It was 1915 to 1916. Genocide was not committed under the Sultan for his brief stay and under Ataturk. However, the rest of the way across here, if you look at the Young Turks and you look at Ataturk, they committed crimes against humanity. They committed war crimes. They attempted ethnic cleansing, which we said in session 1 is not officially recognized by the United Nations. Nevertheless, we have a feel for what that term means. We've been tracking this along the way as well because it seems to be a pretty strong indicator. Religious intolerance. Was this an example of religious intolerance by Talat? Absolutely. Clearly it was. They were trying to kill the Christians, and same with Ataturk. They were killing Armenian Christians and Greeks as well. And the last thing is a lack of what we've been calling loosely a lack of human respect, and we see that in the way that people were marched into the interior, to the desert, the way they were transported like animals in cattle cars, the way they were murdered, and the numerous examples, which we didn't really go over, of torture, of that ingenious, creative, wicked, and brutal creativity that was utilized for torture. Yes, a lack of respect for human beings, and we've seen that. And we just started doing that. We started tracking that during last session. And we see a great deal of people who just demonstrate a complete lack of respect for human life. Well, again, I would like to, of course, thank the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education for their support, the Merrill Collar Educator Series for their support, for you for being here. There will be, in addition to the PowerPoint and the activities, there will be a little simple attendance survey. If you're able to copy and paste that into an email and shoot it to me, that allows me to track attendees. That's important for the Commissioner's Task Force. They like to see the attendance figures, and also for the Merrill Collar Educator Series. That helps out a great deal. Next month, so therefore effective January probably 2nd or 3rd, will be the first part of 2 parts that will be for China. We're going to look at a time period up to about 1949 first, mostly mostly during the 1900s. So say 1900 all the way up to 1949, and then from 1949 to present in the following in February, because it's just too massive an undertaking. Same thing next time. We'll have an overview PowerPoint and hopefully lots of activities that you might be able to utilize with students. Until that time, if you have any questions, you let me know, please, at the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center. My email is sam@hmcec.org. That's sam@hmcec.org. And again, until next time, my name is Sam Parrish from the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center. Thank you.